Hello and welcome to this very special episode of Storyboard 18. I'm Dalshad Irani and we are in conversation with Mark Schneider, the global CEO of Nestle, only the largest food company in the world. Nestle also owns iconic brands, household names like Kit Kat, Nescafe, and of course Maggie, which is an Indian pantry staple and one of the most loved brands in the country. We're absolutely delighted to have you on the show today, Mark, and lots to talk about. But I'm going to sort of kick in and quickly speak to you first about India. And so, can you begin with telling us about what the agenda is for this trip to begin with? And what is your sense of where India is for Nestle on the global map?
Well, thanks for having me. Very excited to be here this week in New Delhi. And what brought us here is a global board of directors meeting for the Nestle Group. It's the first international board of directors meeting after the COVID pandemic. And that, I think, in itself speaks for the importance that the Indian market has for us. So firsthand, we were able to experience some of the shelf presence of our products and brands in Indian retail. We were visiting with our R&D center, so we operate an R&D center in this country. And we were also able to see the impact that Nestle has on supply chain, the way we work with farmers, and the immediate social impact that the company has.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So if I were to ask you, where do you see the India market in, say, 5 years' time? How would you put it?
Look, at the very least, I would tell you this is the Indian decade. You could also say it's the start of the Indian age. And you see a lot of the underlying strengths of this country coming to the forefront now and really building upon each other. You see tremendous growth momentum. And so we want to participate in that. I think we're a key part of it as a food and beverage player. And we've been in this country for so long, deeply ingrained in the social fabric of this country, that I think we stand to benefit from that momentum quite well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let me just go back to sort of a global picture question here. How has this year fared for Nestle so far? What would you say is your report card for the company?
I think it's a very strong year when it comes to organic growth, and that applies to Nestle India, but it also applies to our performance globally. Some of that is driven by global inflation and pricing, but we also see very strong underlying volume developments, especially here in India and some emerging markets. Very strong innovation momentum across the board. Innovation to me is the chief, most sustainable growth driver in addition to population growth and economic development. And so very happy with the year. Obviously, when it comes to the global economic outlook, it's a difficult time, a choppy time. A time when management needs to be very hands-on and focused on day-to-day operations. And I think the team has done a stunning job, including here in India.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let me just ask you to sort of dig into that a little bit and talk about some of the inflationary pressures that we're seeing globally.
Yeah.
How are you sort of working around that to sort of offset some of the issues that you will be facing in terms of rising input cost and keep away from hiking prices too much?
Yeah.
So let's get into that a little bit.
Absolutely. And the hallmark of what we call responsible pricing is very important to us. So rather than just trying to offload everything to the consumer, I think we're looking for internal efficiencies as much as we can. This is a global job, but it also applies to Nestle India. And we understand that affordability is a key aspect, especially in this country for vast areas of the population. And there's no point in engineering the perfect product that no one can afford. And so that's where product attributes and then affordability constantly need to be balanced. And I think we've done a very good job in that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And in that respect, would you say, can you perhaps shed some light on what's happening in some of the other global markets?
Yeah, so what we've seen from early 2021 is one shoe dropping after another when it comes to inflationary pressures in our supply chain. It started with container shipping, which at the end of the COVID first year really skyrocketed and made our products so much more expensive. Energy prices started to spike already in 21. Global shipping overall, in addition to containers and trucking, became more expensive. Then we had a bad coffee harvest in some key markets, and that drove up global coffee prices and also the prices of some agricultural commodities. And then what we're seeing now is the widespread feeding of that into labor cost. And so what you have from one thing that used to be single source only, container shipping, you now have inflationary pressures on almost everything that goes into your product cost. And that's a global phenomenon. There's give or take a few percentage points differences between markets, but there's no market that's exempt from it.
Absolutely. And it's critical you mentioned the affordability factor because,
Yeah.
and that's been, of course, a hallmark of Nestle products. And I mean, Maggie, for instance, as I mentioned, it's a pantry staple in India, and it was comfort food for a lot of people during the pandemic. It was stockpiled in apocalyptic fashion. So let me just sort of change tracks a little bit here and ask you about Maggie. It came back from the brink in absolute dramatic fashion after the 2015 crisis. You weren't at Nestle back then, but if you could perhaps tell me, when you look back at that time when you joined Nestle, what are some of the observations you made and some of the learnings that came out of that episode?
Absolutely. And let me say first and foremost, the team and the leadership here in India have done a stunning job in gaining back the public's trust into this brand, and also making it very clear in test after test that the product had always been safe and that there was no issue. And over and above that, rather than looking back, looking forward and seeing how can we address food safety, how can we maintain the trust of the public, how can we improve regulatory oversight. We started a Food Safety Institute. I think we're getting the point across to the public that we're incredibly committed to food safety and quality. And then, of course, all the historic aspects and the strong and long-standing allegiance to that Maggie brand, those were not gone. And couple that with some meaningful product innovation, especially when it comes to the nutritional values and micronutrient fortification. And yeah, you have all the ingredients for a strong recovery. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Absolutely. There was something very interesting. In fact, your India MD Suresh had told me once about Maggie, which is it's the truly masked, customizable brand. There's a Maggie version. Everyone has a Maggie version. So a slight sort of detour here on the questions. Do you have a Maggie version?
Look, with the European products, the European range of Maggie, the most iconic one is the original seasoning. And I think every kid in Germany and Switzerland grew up with that on the table. And so, yeah, that's in our pantry at home. And, we always add a sprinkle to a dish. And so it just gives it a very special flavor.
Absolutely, absolutely. So switching tracks again here. Let's talk about the new bottom line. People, planet, profits.
Yeah.
If you could just perhaps get into each of those aspects and tell me what Nestle is doing to address some of those challenges that you're seeing to sort of realize this new bottom line.
Yeah. Look, increasingly people judge companies by what they're doing for society at large and for the planet in the face of growing environmental concerns. Obviously, people recognize that we're a for-profit company, so that's why the third aspect of the bottom line shouldn't go out of focus. But the first two, people and planet, I think that is becoming more and more important. The younger, the better educated, and the more affluent consumers are, the more this is on their minds. And I think these days, in the age of smartphones and a fully digital supply chain, the visibility on everything you do is so much higher, so there's no place to hide. I think that whole focus meets with a historic cultural aspect of ours quite well, and that is we were always a stock-quoted company, and one that is obviously subject to all the pressures and all the responsibilities that come with being a stock-quoted company. But in addition to that, this strong societal focus and a strong environmental focus that have been part of our DNA. When you're dealing with farmers around the world for more than 150 years, when you see them exposed to the elements of the weather and see them exposed to all the things that can go wrong in a bad season, that puts planet thinking and weather thinking and climate thinking right into your DNA. And when you're feeding people around the world, as we do in more than 180 markets, then clearly, being part of society and having a strong societal concern and responsibility That's also part of our DNA. So to us, navigating in this new environment is basically second nature.
Let me get into some of the things that you are perhaps driving and that's top on your agenda in some of the specifics. Of course, we know that sustainability is an essential operating principle for any responsible company and one striving for financial success. So what is top on your agenda? What are you dialing up at this point in time?
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that.
So we are very committed to sustainability, as you say, and obviously there's a whole list of issues. The one that I would describe as the defining one for our age and for our generation is climate protection and reducing CO2 and methane emissions. Obviously, there's lots of other priorities, but I'm very convinced that when the next several generations will look back to this age, they will judge us by whether we get a handle on that situation or whether we just let it slip and flow, and that would have pretty catastrophic consequences for the climate around the world. So that one we're very committed to. We were one of the early signatories to the science-based targets to limit Earth's warming to 1.5 degrees. We were one of the first people to issue then a very detailed net zero roadmap that would get us there by 2050. There is a commitment to get the greenhouse gas emissions down by 20% by the year 2025 and by 50% by the year 2030. So near-term action is also very important to us. Don't shove it down to the long term. Do something now in this decade. And this is also what the public is judging us by. We're already on our way down. So peak carbon is behind us. It was somewhere around 2018, 2019. We're on the way down now. And that is in spite of the fact that the company is growing very strongly. So, I mean, sometimes there's a misconception. People say, you want to reduce carbon emissions, but when you have growth, don't you overcompensate? No, when we're saying minus 20% or minus 50%, that is after considering the growth. And so it's a pretty meaningful reduction when it comes to carbon per kilo of the products that we sell.
On the subject of climate, let's talk a little bit about perhaps the plastic issue.
Yeah.
And how, I mean, FMCG companies, of course, some largest consumers of plastic, and eventually that becomes waste. Let's talk a little bit about what are some of the meaningful actions that you've taken with outcomes that have been desirable, and where are you placed on sort of getting to this waste-free future?
Absolutely. And plastics packaging would have been a close second right after climate protection when it comes to priorities. And you have a situation here where plastics packaging have been growing for 60, 70 years due to its superb properties when it comes to food safety and shelf life. And it's been only over time that societies around the world came to see some of the downsides. And that is when it spills into the environment, you have widespread pollution and the material doesn't degrade for long periods of time. So once we recognized this, we made a pledge that by the year 2025, our packaging should be recyclable or reusable. We're making very good, meaningful progress towards that. Obviously, it won't be done with that 2025 pledge alone. You have to think ahead of that and beyond that, because recyclable, when there's no recycling infrastructure alone, doesn't solve the problem. So that's why the term you're using, the waste-free future, I think that's the ultimate goal. And that's why, you know, even with that intermediate commitment to 2025, there will be lots of work left to do. We are, to my knowledge, the only large food and beverage company that has its own research institute for packaging sciences, because we did not just want to end up as a passenger to the packaging industry and whatever they have to offer. We also wanted to do our own research and development into better packaging. So one key focus, for example, is paperization. Paper packaging can take over from plastic packaging in many cases, but you have to check very carefully for food safety and shelf life, especially think about a climate like India with you know, high temperatures, lots of moisture. And so that's the detailed work we're doing product by product.
And keeping the cost in mind, of course.
And keeping the cost and affordability in mind, absolutely.
Let me get a bit of your perspective on sort of industry-wide, from an industry perspective. Do you think companies very often perhaps pass on the responsibility to consumers?
Look, I think we all have to help. We got to do our part, and obviously consumer behavior is another essential part to get the job done. So take recyclability. You can make your packaging recyclable. You can also try to sponsor recycling infrastructure, but the consumer has to help, because the consumer at the end of the day will also need to separate some of the waste. And so I'm not in favor of just shifting responsibility in a wholesale manner to consumers, but we all have to help, whether it's as producers or consumers, retailers, government. It's a systemic issue, and we all have to do our part to overcome it.
Hold on to that thought. We'll take a quick commercial break and be right back to talk about how Nestle is future-proofing its brands and business by focusing on three aspects: people, planet, and profits. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Storyboard 18 on CNBC-TV18. I'm Delshad Irani, and I'm in conversation with Mark Schneider, the CEO of Nestle. Let me go back a little bit to the bottom line again, and talk about something that sort of ties all three of them in, right? Which is purpose. And purpose, of course, has been a bit of a buzzword for the last over a decade almost. And every company is using the term purpose in everything from their marketing communications to internal. What do you make of using purpose as a sort of a signal to the world? And how has Nestle sort of tied that into some of the initiatives that it has done? And because it has received a lot of criticism, from investors as well as consumers.
Yeah.
So what do you make of the trend?
Yeah. Look, purpose is important. I mean, you want to know what you go to work for, what you're trying to do. And when it comes to a large organization, thousands of people in a factory or a research and development center, it's hard to motivate someone by the bottom line only and by profits. So it is about what do you do for society, what do you do for people around you. But it is important not to overdo it, and also understand we're doing this within the confines of a publicly quoted company, and a company that belongs to investors and that needs to offer decent returns to these investors. And so the balance between the two, to me, is the important thing. Purpose has been criticized when it has been blown out of proportion, but it is important. And profits have been criticized in the 80s and 90s in the world of shareholder-only thinking when they were blown out of proportion. To me, it comes down to balance. You need to have a purpose in life, otherwise, it's a bit meaningless. But you also have to live your life according to some of the economic rules that we're all subject to.
Just extending that thought on purpose and expectations that consumers have today from corporations. I mean, it's beyond just delivering a great product, right? They want companies, as you mentioned, to stand for something. Yeah. And one space that we saw that in happening was, of course, with the war that's going on between Russia and Ukraine. So what is your stance on companies pulling out their operations and some of their brands? And Nestle did that in a limited fashion, of course, keeping some essential products in the market. Yeah. Where are you on that front?
Yeah. So look, I think I'm speaking for everyone in saying that we wish for nothing more than for peace. But we had a very strong presence both in Russia and the Ukraine. What stands out in my view is the strong efforts we've undertaken as a company to support the Ukraine in this war. So we've been bringing hundreds of tons, by now more than 1,000 tons of food and much needed baby food, for example, medical nutrition, into the country, at times under pretty significant danger. We kept operating our facilities in the Ukraine. We had 3 manufacturing facilities there. One we had to temporarily shut down because of war action, but 2 others we kept working. So keeping up essential food supply to the people of Ukraine was important. Our people signed up to house hundreds of Ukrainian refugees. So I think there was a lot of strong solidarity with the people of Ukraine. When it comes to Russia, we clearly discontinued and suspended some international brands such as Nespresso, Kit Kat, Nesquik, to cite a few examples. But on essentials, on parts like what I mentioned before, medical nutrition or infant nutrition, we also have a long-standing history that when we serve a market, we do not walk away at times of conflict. Whenever it's possible safely to continue supply, we believe there is a responsibility that people have. There is a reason why food is usually exempted from sanctions, just like medical supplies, and we wanted to live up to that ethos.
Now, the food space, of course, especially in the past 2 years, again, accelerated by the pandemic, has been booming. We've seen a lot of new players emerging, small companies, D2C products emerging. And we're also seeing large corporations getting into the FMCG space. So what is your reading? What is your reading of these sort of emerging brands? And do you see them as a collective threat, perhaps? And a follow-up to that question, what's your acquisition strategy?
Yeah. So let me say first and foremost, I'm incredibly proud, especially in this country, what the Nestle India team has made out of these two iconic brands, Nescafé and KitKat. So the development of both of these has been tremendous. And now, in the face of these small challenger brands, I think the way to compete and the way to succeed is to take a story from their playbook. And basically, what people want is novelty. They don't want the same product day in, day out for the next 10 years. So what you have to do is couple the trust that people have in these iconic brands with that endless seeking of novelty. And that's why variety and limited series and special editions and all of those, I think, keep brands alive and vibrant. You can also say the same thing about global versus local. So KitKat and Nescafé are global brands, but nothing stands in the way of giving these global brands local attributes and making them particularly appealing to a local population. That could be either through the packaging or some of the special flavors you put in. And so this is, in my view, the way, in the face of these challenger brands, to keep global iconic brands alive and relevant to consumers. When it comes to acquisitions across the board, globally and across our categories, very open to it. I think we have a good acquisition track record over the past years. But let me also say we've been always very selective here and commercially sound. It's easy in the face of sky-high valuations to get carried away. And I think especially before prices recently came down, at a day and age when valuations were really high, it would have been easy to overpay here and there. I think we've been quite sensitive to that. We dialed up some of the divestitures we had to do at times when valuations were really strong, but we were very selective on new acquisitions. But going forward, look, at the right price, we're open for business.
So I read that you try every new product and even perhaps innovation that comes out of Nestle. So do you generally sort of give your feedback then as the CEO or a consumer?
So you're quite right. I'm a self-proclaimed product junkie. I love new products and their features and how they stack up compared to what was on the market previously. I also believe it is essentially the product that fills a brand with life. You know, a brand without constant, meaningful innovation doesn't stay alive. And so that's why the product focus is important. I'm very blessed that basically just upstairs from my office in Switzerland, there is a trial kitchen. And so the happiest moments I spend in that trial kitchen, just sampling new products. But you're touching on a very important point. When you give your feedback, you have to give your feedback as one more voice and not as the directive voice of the CEO. Because at the end of the day, what matters in fast-moving consumer goods is how appealing something is to a broader public. If I feel very rarely that something is clearly not ready, I would be more directive. But if it comes down to just, my personal taste as opposed to someone else's taste, this is where you have to be democratic. And in the face of strong data that consumers wanted, I would always go with that data. If there's some finishing touches here and there that you can offer, I think it's one more opinion that will help the team. And it's very, very rare. In fact, can recollect for the last few years a situation where I would say, look, this one, sorry, we have to stop. And that also, in a sense, is a testament to the strength of the product development that happens inside the company.
India and global markets, how would you sum up your outlook for India and global markets for the time to come?
Yeah. So on India, I'm definitely more optimistic than on global markets in general. Global markets, I think short term, there is a definite risk of a recession, at the very least in Western Europe, but maybe stretching beyond that to the United States. And so that's why the global economic outlook right now is kind of dim. That has to do with the war, it has to do with rising interest rates, and also the fact that maybe in the face of inflation, the consumers will pull back when it comes to volumes in some markets, in some categories. India, I think, I admire the economic wisdom of the chart and the course it has taken, and I think that's paying off fully now. And then, of course, when it comes to the next 5 to 10 years, you see that huge demographic dividend that India has. So many major markets around the world will start shrinking. India will keep growing when it comes to the workforce, when it comes to people in their peak earning years. And that always goes hand in hand with significant economic opportunities. So we're very bullish. There was a reason why our board of directors came here, because they wanted to see and experience the opportunities firsthand. And we're very, very excited of making the most of that.
Thank you so much for your time, Mark. It was lovely chatting with you, and we hope to catch you again on your next trip to India.
Thanks for having me, and I can promise you I'll be back before 5 years from now.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for watching Storyboard 18. That's all from us. Keep watching. You can catch more conversations with business leaders and marketers on Storyboard 18, CNBC TV 18. Thank you.